Before we get into this, just a little bit of a warning for you. Wonder Egg Priority is unlike anything I've talked about previously on Octo's Corner. It represents, for better or for worse, a great deal of sensitive topics and explores how those living in Japanese society deal with them, in large part through the use of metaphorical storytelling and fantastical settings. This includes, but is not limited to, the subjects of suicide, euthanasia, the morality of cloning, emotional and physical abuse, and mental health. Viewer discretion is advised. So I'm just now realizing, as I put this together, that I've been calling them Seeno Elves, when they're actually called Seeno Evils, and that might be because of the way the subtitles are, but I also speak Japanese, so I should know better, right? Well, just so that you all know, and in case you didn't read the pinned comment that basically said the same thing in the last video, in Japanese, this name is extremely ambiguous. They're called Mitemi ni Furi, which literally just means pretend not to see, so Seeno Elves just sounded better in my head, and since I was watching it with somebody who doesn't speak Japanese, I had access to the subtitles and just sort of went with what I saw. On a first viewing at least. I didn't actually notice when I was rewatching the show for this video, because I haven't been using English subtitles. I've been using the Japanese ones and just sort of writing my own English subtitles in where needed. So it wasn't until I looked at the fan wiki to cross-reference something about Kurumi that I ended up realizing that there was a discrepancy there, and so that's why it hasn't been addressed until now. But from here going forward, I'm going to be calling them by their official English name instead of elves. I just wanted to get that out of the way before moving on. Okay, cool. Speaking of moving on, we're still stuck in episode 1 and have by now been talking about it for almost twice as long as the actual runtime of the episode, so it should come as no surprise that there are still a few things left to talk about before moving on to episode 2. First of all, the simulation does in fact have lasting effects on those who do battle within it. We see that for certain when Ai completely collapses due to blood loss during breakfast and is subsequently brought to the hospital. Again, the teacher is here, taking an unusual amount of interest in Ai considering that she never actually goes to school. Keep that in mind, it's important for later. He arguably hasn't done anything a normal teacher wouldn't do, it's just the way he talks about her and his tone of voice that seem ever so slightly out of the ordinary compared to any normal high school teacher. Kurumi is still a bit of a mystery, and there's no definitive answer as to why she seems so knowledgeable about everything, but I happened to notice a fan theory while combing through the series subreddit that I think might actually have some believability to it, so we'll start there. Feel free to pause the video and look this over if you'd like. I won't be going over it in 100% detail, so it's better if you have context before I start talking about it. Have you read it? Okay, good. I think there's a high likelihood of it being correct to a certain degree, but there are still just a few things about Kurumi and the way she's talked about that don't add up. The first is the conspicuous way the first simulation ends, with Kurumi saying, "Please remember me," and the loudspeaker, which is, again, the same voice from earlier saying, which obviously carries a lot of implications with it. The weirdest and most telling piece of dialogue, though, happens when Ai asks the bug if Kurumi also committed suicide, to which the bug replies,
"No comment. No commento."
Knowing the way Ura and Aka operate, it could be that they're simply messing with her, but I think the more likely answer is that the bug refuses to answer because, in most cases, the girls in the Wonder Eggs have committed suicide, but Kurumi was killed by a dot hyphen, making her the exception. So rather than explain all of that, it just lets Ai come to her own conclusion about what happened, which unfortunately means that, unless there's some sort of background detail later on, this plot point just needs to be left as ambiguous, or a plot hole, or just something that we can't fully explain. I'm going to let you decide which one it is for now, and based on how often this kind of thing happens throughout the rest of the series, I'll decide what I think once we get to the end, which is a very, very long way away from where we are now. Kurumi aside, let's get a feel for our new surroundings before we move on. First and foremost, these two are called Ura and Aka, and we'll get back to them later. Especially you. Oh, trust me, I'm gonna love talking about you. There's also a lot more to explain in terms of the setting here, but again, the time to talk about that is going to come up much later on. The only thing we could even do right now without ruining everything would be to try and analyze every single flower species we see and try to see if their use is thematically relevant or not, which would take way too much time to realistically... As if I have that kind of time. No. Not to mention recording and actually editing that segment together. That would be an entire video unto itself. No, instead of talking about that for the next 20 minutes, I think most of you would prefer if we just moved on to episode 2 already. So let's just do that. In the meantime, though, you will be seeing the various flower species explained in the bottom of the video for the next little bit. I'm not going to analyze them. I feel comfortable letting you guys do that for me, but I did define them according to the Japanese language of flowers, and I cross-referenced that with the historical English meanings for each flower, so feel free to let me know if you feel that there's any significance to that meaning. I might pin your comment if there's any particularly insightful theories about this, but other than that, let's cover the final piece of episode 1 and finally move on to talking about episode 2 and the rest of the series, basically. When Ai finds out that she isn't the only person involved with the simulation, she's extremely eager to meet the others. The interesting thing about this girl, though, is that there's actually a lot we can learn about her before she says anything at all, or even before Ohto says anything at all to her. For example, we can immediately understand that this individual is used to this procedure, as evidenced by the fact that she buys her egg in bulk and even has a special carrying case for them prepared beforehand. We also know that this isn't her first time doing any of this, thanks to her body language and nonchalant animation. If it was her first time buying eggs in bulk, she'd probably be acting a little bit less relaxed about this action than we see her acting here. Her actions are almost robotic, and her sense of style is very clearly a reflection of her personality. Emotionless, dull, devoid of any kind of actual character. She moves in a very deliberate way here, with occasionally stiff movements that are always very calculated compared to the sloppy, unbalanced way that Ai moves in the very same shot. This shot is actually extremely important for that very reason, if you can believe that. It creates a contrast, a literal and metaphorical distance between Ai and this new character. This contrast is further exemplified by the dialogue, which is so quickly brushed off that it's hard to think of it implying any sort of significance at all. And yet, of course, there's significance to it. Literal significance. It's incredibly easy to miss, but it is there. Those of you who've already seen the special finale episode, pay very close attention to what I'm about to say. Ai comments on her figure being close to perfect, which is actually an extremely clever way to foreshadow the fact that her body is unnatural. It's the series pointing directly to a very specific detail, and we know it isn't a one-off line because Akka responds to it by saying, implying that there's something worth noticing about this detail. That said, obviously the more immediately pressing line you'll notice during this conversation is that Akka states that the two of them are worried about her. The same two individuals who are totally unfazed by the visceral nightmare world Ohto was seriously injured inside of are worried about her. That's kind of a big deal, because again, they aren't really bothered by very many things. These are all details which call back, in certain ways, to the core thesis we talked about previously, but they don't actually start to take noticeable shape until the beginning of episode 2. This girl is Nieru Aonuma. Her given name is spelled with hiragana, which also means it can be interpreted as a conjugation of the Japanese verb neru, which means to sleep. It's a fitting name, but again, we'll get into the reasons why that is later on. As clearly seen in the beginning moments of episode 2, Nieru does not like to engage in conversation without purpose. She's driven, focused on her one and only goal, and she does not see a need for any sort of idle chatter in between the steps she takes to get there. No matter how hard Ai tries to interact with her, Nieru refuses to acknowledge Ai's existence in any meaningful way. That much is obvious, and not exactly exciting to analyze, but what's interesting is that while the focus of the dialogue is entirely on Nieru, the visual language of the scene tells a different story entirely. The moment Ai enters this scene, she becomes the focal point, with Nieru immediately getting blurred out. The way Ai sheepishly glances around and nervously tries to interact is a stark contrast from the way she acted before. Her hood is down, and her whole head is proudly visible as she walks in the light, something that episode 1's depiction of the character tactfully avoided. It shows that she's learned from the events of the first episode, and seemingly meant what she said about not just sitting back and watching other people suffer anymore. Of course, she still covers up her heterochromia, but what matters is that an attempt is being made here. Likely the first in a very long time. The same girl who previously hid in the shadows now stands with at least a small amount of confidence out in the light, trying to move forward. To hammer this point home, the background of this shot shows a mural of sunflowers, the plant which is meant to represent Ohto as a character, as we discussed before. The mural begins in shadow, then shifts through a small middle ground and into the light. Nieru chooses to ignore it completely and continue walking down her own path, not even for a moment, pausing to notice the change in color or assess what might await her in the light. But when Ai walks through, though, she stops, unable to so freely walk into the light. It takes effort and willpower to force herself to move forward, something that comes through very clearly in the way this scene is animated. I also want to point out that the way Ai deliberately stops without walking into the light proves my point from earlier about her not wanting to step into the light at all. Her brief moment of confidence went ignored, and as such she begins to regress back into isolation before forcing herself onward. Though, granted, she still is shown in shadows for the majority of her screen time up until the opening begins. When Nieru finally does choose to acknowledge Ai, it isn't with a proper response to Ai's questions, but is instead with a question of her own. She isn't willing to give out any information about herself, yet for some reason Ai isn't suspicious of that and answers right away. After all, this conversation isn't actually about Nieru at all. It's about Ai. She's the forefront and focus of every shot. She's the one who we're learning more about. Perhaps this is why, when discussing who it is Ai is fighting for, Nieru so swiftly accuses Ohto of fighting for herself. It's only then that Ai starts to actually pay attention to Nieru beyond simply trying to initiate conversation. Only then, you see, does the focus of the camera shift. Immediately, every suspicion we've built up over the course of the last 2 minutes is confirmed when Nieru perfectly recites the true problem with Ai directly to her face.
今の自分が嫌い。だから行く。怖いけどまた行く。
Nieru doesn't need other people for validation. She doesn't care about Ai's need to heal and isn't preoccupied with any sort of emotional hang-up about who she is or what she's trying to do. Information is what Nieru values, and fittingly, it's the one thing that she refused to give up, until finally, Ai asked the right question. Nieru faces the camera. There's an interesting interaction which happens in the next scene between Ohto, her mother, and the overly friendly teacher from the end of episode 1. A teacher who, if I might add, becomes progressively creepier in the way that he interacts with Ohto as the series goes on. While there's certainly a lot to unpack about that, the only immediately pressing detail is the way Ai immediately reverts back to full isolation mode the moment she sees him, staying that way for the next little while. There's a lot to discuss about this for sure, but instead of talking about it right now, I think we'll save that discussion for when we get a little further in, and you'll probably be able to see why. For now, though, let's get acquainted with what you might call the pattern of Wonder Egg priority. At its core, Episode 2 is doing two seemingly separate things at more or less the same time, and that's ultimately the pattern the rest of the series is going to be following from here on out. What makes the series difficult to understand on a first viewing is that it can be overwhelming to figure out both of these things at once, while still trying to follow the overarching plot, which involves the main cast of characters and their respective emotional grievances. While up until now I've been doing a lot of extra work to try and showcase both at the same time, a pattern is thankfully starting to emerge that's going to make Wonder Egg priority a lot easier to follow from here on out. That means that unless it's relevant to the overall point of Wonder Egg priority, most of the Wonder Killers won't have to be mentioned in excessive detail here. In fact, some of them probably won't even need to be mentioned at all, thankfully. Up until now, I haven't actually been focusing on anything in much detail that isn't directly related to Ohto herself. Yes, we briefly discussed Nieru's introductory scene, but just like the show itself, the focus and commentary wasn't actually about Nieru at all, beyond a surface-level description of her. It's always been about Ohto. Wonder Egg priority coats itself in metaphorical imagery to be sure, but assuming you've been following along, you've probably noticed that it hasn't actually been making any statements about its social issues beyond blanket admissions that they are issues and that they have lasting effects on those who suffer because of them. Episode 1, for example, claims to be about bullying on the tin, but it actually isn't. It doesn't make any statements about the origin of the problem or give any insights on how to properly end it beyond what actions the main character can take to ease its effects on the sufferer. The bully is a one-dimensional monster with no purpose other than to be a bully. And while I can choose to stand up for those who are being bullied, that ultimately doesn't do anything to actually get rid of the problem. It just makes the bullying easier to deal with for Kurumi. In fact, to start with, Ai actually contributes to the problem, commenting that Kurumi has a terrible attitude, and even going so far as to say that she hates her. In episode 2, we meet Minami Suzuhara, who Ai immediately compliments for her nice figure, but beyond that, treats as a lower individual. She orders Minami around and foolishly believes that she can protect her, but doesn't actually seem to care in the slightest about trying to understand what Minami is going through. She looks nice, that's what matters to Ai, for reasons we'll get into later. That, and of course, the ever-present goal of saving Koito, which Ai explains to Kurumi before even bothering to ask what it is Minami might be suffering from. To be blunt about it, Ai does not care about Kurumi in the slightest. She's working through her own problems, and given how emotionally strenuous those problems are, it makes sense that she would feel that way. The problem is, that insensitivity towards others' feelings isn't going to solve anything for anyone except for Ai herself, as the battle between Ai and Minami's Wonder Killer very quickly points out. In other words, what we're looking at here isn't actually commentary on societal problems in the typical sense. It's not going to be going into these issues expecting them to be difficult to understand, because they aren't actually supposed to be the narrative focus. These issues are background elements meant to teach the main character, in this case Ai, how to improve as a person. In episode 2 specifically, the issue is that she's being insensitive, which wouldn't even be a massive problem if it weren't for the fact that she clearly doesn't view Minami's struggles as important at first. When she compliments Minami, the poor girl's reaction tells us Ai has touched a nerve, or at the very least, that Minami's figure is a sensitive subject for her. This is then immediately followed up by Minami verbally confirming that her figure isn't something she's proud of, but instead a source of stress because of her abusive coach. I can't really think of a way to explain why this is problematic without using an object-based analogy, so let's return to the kitchen for a moment. Okay, so we have the egg, which represents Wonder Egg priority itself, right? And in order to prepare a proper omelet, there's a few extra ingredients we're gonna need. By placing these important social issues in the background, instead only using them as guide rails to keep the main characters developing in most cases, Wonder Egg priority feels as though it's saying, today we're cooking with these ingredients. These ingredients are here too, and we'll put them next to the plate when we're finished cooking, but we aren't actually going to use them for anything. They're just gonna be there. Now, I realize that I'm here to analyze and not criticize. And please note this isn't always the case in Wonder Egg, but for episode 2 at least, the pressure to deliver and the psychological damage that can result from that pressure are not the narrative focus. That being the case, there's no reason to show the teacher physically abusing Minami in such grotesque detail. At least not as far as I can tell. If all this scene is meant to do is make the statement that there's a difference between pushing you to be your best at what you do and verbal abuse, congratulations. And that is a problem. You're right. Granted, you could make the argument that Ai suffers from the same problem as the Wonder Killer, but to a lesser extent, where she only really wants to use Minami as a stepping stone to get what she really wants, another shot at closure as opposed to fame and recognition, and that she doesn't really listen to or treat Minami with the proper level of care and respect. But on the other hand, I think there's a pretty big difference between being unintentionally self-centered and, well, this. And I suppose there may also be a point to be made that her imperfect figure in both forms is proof of her hypocrisy as a teacher, since despite how hard she pushes her students, she is far less than stern toward herself, but I wouldn't go so far as to argue that her form prior to the transformation is something to be ashamed of. She looks fairly normal, if you ask me, albeit a little bit creepy in the face department. But as far as I can tell, this issue, which is very real and has real effects on real people, isn't being used for anything substantial enough to excuse the visuals in this fight. The monster design and brutality seems to be used for nothing but pure shock value. And if I may be frank about that, it does a massive disservice to the rest of your show when you do things for shock value. It's an important issue, yes, but did you need to be quite so on the nose about it? If not, and there isn't explicit meaning behind doing it this way other than just to point out that it is indeed a problem that could lead someone to kill themselves, it feels strange that the overall message of this episode isn't explicitly connected to the Wonder Killer in any meaningful way. In fact, This kind of grotesque, shallow symbolism is incredibly commonplace throughout Wonder Egg Priority as a whole, which is what I meant by drawing attention to Koito's death scene in episode 1. It is disrespectful and hurtful to those who are affected by these issues to so bluntly and lightly touch on them without having a very good reason for doing it. In my opinion, it would have been equally effective to simply show Ai's reaction or just Koito's feet on the ground. We did not need flies swarming the corpse or this frankly disgusting full-body shot with neon blood staining the ground. This isn't Danganronpa, after all. I meant to take this seriously. I understand that the image is burned into Ai's memory, that she can't forget what she's seen, but with how brilliantly subtle Wonder Egg's opening moments were, I have to take issue with how this is done. I get that the teacher is abusive toward Minami, but did we really need to see her make such blatant, unbelievable excuses explaining why she was never punished for abusing her students? Did we really need her breasts to vomit colored paint blobs like this? Well, okay. If you're like me, you might have thought that these grotesque designs came from Japanese history or folklore, but I can actually assure you that this is not usually the case. Aside from the Tengu design, none of these monsters are meant to evoke traditional yokai or oni-based metaphors. At least, not many of them. And I know this because when I researched the designs in preparation for this video, I found out that all of the Wonder Killer designs are actually inspired by the bosses in Cuphead. Oh, but hold on, Octo, I hear you say from beyond the screen. Aren't you getting a little ahead of yourself? Isn't there a bit more to episode 2 that you aren't discussing? What gives? And to that I say, you're absolutely right. There is. And yes, I guess it is kind of a big deal. When Ohto Ai again finds herself in a school as the setting for episode 2, a couple of very specific questions start arising. While it does seemingly contrast the idea that Ohto Ai is a visitor to this world, which I presented before, I have what I believe is a pretty solid explanation for that. You see, rather than the specific setting, I think the visual language of episode 1 was actually referring to the simulation itself as an unfamiliar world that Ai is a guest in. While there is circumstantial evidence to back up the idea that the dream school is the same building as Ai's actual school, there are one or two things that don't add up here. The door which leads to Ai's actual school roof building is one of them. It wouldn't need to be there if the building was the same architecturally, because in that case Ai could have just gone to the roof herself. No magical teleport door needed. There's also the visual contrast between the school's roofs as seen here. The point is that even though the school does have a visual similarity to Ai's actual school, I think it's more meant to be a generic Japanese school building than Ai's building in particular. Yes, she does immediately know where to go in order to find the bathroom in episode 1, but that's honestly just because most school buildings in Japan follow a similar design philosophy. There isn't much of a difference in layout from school to school. Either way, the school setting is significant, not because it's Ai's specific school, but in a more general sense, it's important because all of Ai's trauma stems from things that happened at school. Ai was bullied to a certain extent, but not nearly as bad as Koito was bullied. In a similar vein, we know from later on that Koito experienced the pressure to deliver as well, to live up to expectations based on her art, in which situation, Ai was a direct competitor. These traumatic events we witness are Koito's problems, not Ai's. Though ironically, that makes them Ai's problems by extension, and by Ai's constant need to play victim. What we're meant to take away from all of this is that even though Ai constantly blames herself for Koito's death, she's taking the wrong approach to it. Koito is not being bullied because she's friends with Ai, she's being bullied because of her rumored inappropriate relationship with the teacher. And on the subject of that creepy teacher, have a look at this face, why don't you? I don't have anything to say about that for now, it's just really intimidating facial expression, and I can see why I would be so tormented by it. Note that this is probably the most horrific moment in the entire episode. potentially even the entire series, and it gives added context to the way Ai reacts when the teacher is surprisingly over at her house later that day, why she immediately cuts herself off from him in every way. It's true what she says here, in every sense of the word. She doesn't hate her teacher. She's terrified of him. Okay, so far, Wonder Egg Priority Episode 2, while at times grotesque, to the point of being unnecessarily gratuitous, is not all things considered a bad episode, though it is worrying because of how convoluted a story it's beginning to become. Whereas before we had a statement on artificial intelligence and the lines that blur as a result of its progression, what's happening now is completely different. A character-driven call to action and suicide prevention type of show, explaining why people choose to end their lives and what may be done to prevent others from following suit. That's why Ura and Akka reprimand Ai for being lazy or choosing to run away from the problem rather than confront it. It's through this experience that more of the details we weren't able to get a full grasp on start coming more and more to light, and Ai's ignorance of the way Koito is horrifically abused is, as previously mentioned, not all that different from the way she reacts in episode 1 when she abandons Kurumi. From this point onward, the story is going to very quickly become very complicated, and as such, it's going to become impossible to analyze literally everything like I've been doing up until now without spoiling things for certain other characters early, ruining the impact of certain moments, and ultimately just creating what can only be described as an indecipherable web of brain teasers and unsolvable riddles. Believe me, I have tried. There is a reason it took me this long to talk about Wonder Egg. But for that reason, if you haven't already seen Wonder Egg Priority all the way to the end, now is the time to stop this video and go watch it. I have no idea why you'd be at this point in the video without having already seen it, but consider this your final spoiler warning anyway. Just as one final notice before we start getting into really complicated stuff. At this point, we have at least two different stories to study in Wonder Egg Priority. One is the story of artificial intelligence, which we talked about at length before. The other is the story of Ohto Ai's quest to understand the multitude of factors which led her friend to kill herself. In order to do that, she needs to protect others from their problems, learning how to see beyond herself, and teaching others how to fight against the urge to give up, fighting against the temptation of death. Now, in all honesty, there's nothing wrong with telling a story through disconnected pieces like this. The problem, you see, is that Ai isn't the only other person this story is about. It's easy to write a character like Nieru or Rika or even Momoe off as fighting for the same reasons. After all, they also lost friends and need closure on them, don't they? In a broad sense, yes, but to just say Wonder Egg is about fighting for closure and leaving it at that is to ignore the significance of scenery, identity, and, well, trauma itself as presented within the series. Because for each of these characters, a story is going to unfold slightly differently. That ultimately leaves us with 5 completely separate narratives, only loosely connected to each other by being told at the same time. I say this because at this point we're going to need to talk about story number 3. That is, Nieru Aonuma. What little we actually know of her is that she's doing this whole Wonder Egg thing to save her sister. But beyond that, those of us who are familiar with this character's actions over the course of the series will already know that Nieru here is probably the single most complex character in the series, despite, not having a personality. In her attempt to move forward, Ohto Ai visits Nieru in the ICU, which is strange, because given who Nieru actually is, it doesn't make much sense for her to be in a hospital. This scene is made even more strange by the fact that Nieru is hooked up to an oxygen mask, but much like the life support units, that mask isn't actually doing anything. Every piece of machinery in this room is turned off, even the lights, so there's no status on a heartbeat. And despite it seeming like such an obvious detail in hindsight, I have to admit, it took a few viewings before I realized that Nieru isn't actually breathing in this scene either. Pair that with the suspicious dialogue of the mannequin boys from earlier, in which they audibly doubt Nieru's motivations and suggest that it's possible she in fact only wants to kill herself by taking on so many eggs at once, and suddenly Nieru becomes a little bit more off-putting. Personally, I find this character infuriating despite all of this, but we'll get into that later on. It's just interesting that they chose to emphasize what they did here is all. Ai herself is pretty similar to the viewer in this case. She doesn't question any of this because, frankly, like the viewer, she's pretty preoccupied with trying to make sense of what happened earlier, as well as attempting to get closer to Nieru as a friend. She doesn't seem to notice the red flags here, but then again, that's kind of what we're starting to learn is her biggest character flaw. She never seems to read into details or notice red flags. Case in point, what happened with Koito. And furthermore, what happened to her when she discovered the Wonder Eggs in the first place. When I said before that she wouldn't normally stop to bury a dead bug, that the show's opening moments signified some sort of difference from her normal behavior, this is what I meant. It was unlike her to notice such a seemingly small detail, unless of course she too was being tempted into death in the moments that she found it. Then, of course, there had to be a scene that ruined everything. Nieru breathes, or I guess more accurately smells real hard, and Ohto is pictured confidently in the light. Though, at the very least, you could make the argument that she's in the light as a metaphor for her making progress toward her goal, that this action represents a step in the right direction, even though the characters are moving to the left. Nieru slowly smiles, and the light seems brighter than ever. Ohto is starting to change. For once, Ohto isn't afraid. Not of people, or fitting in, or even being bullied. Everything seems to be going fine. Until... Up until now, my method of covering Wonder Egg priority has been to cover literally everything, scene by scene, in explicit detail. Discussing both what I find admirable about the series' direction, as well as what I dislike, and doing all of this as it becomes relevant in the show. However, as I hinted at before, from this point onward, I no longer feel a need to do that. At least not to quite the same degree. That's because by this point in time, I'm sure you all understand, or at least have been reminded, of the kind of program Wonder Egg priority actually is. And as such, I don't see too much of an extra need to uncover every little thing in every little scene. That, and I would eventually like to talk about something that isn't Wonder Egg priority on this channel, and with the pacing up until now being what it has been, there is absolutely no way that that's ever happening. In other words, I'm sure you get the point by now. Each episode of Wonder Egg pits its respective main character against one of the reasons that they lost their friend, which it does because suicide is a complicated issue which rarely has only one point of origin. That much I can appreciate. What I find less praiseworthy, however, is the severity in which the thinly veiled metaphors which represent those problems are shown and discussed. For the sake of pacing, Wonder Egg can't afford to do much other than draw attention to these problems in society, and if I'm being honest, part of the reason why is that the show isn't actually trying to do anything beyond a surface-level shock and terror kind of presentation of them. As discussed, it's about life, death, and science, not about suicide, idol culture, or gender. Though obviously it presents these themes as various side stories for those interested in exploring them. Rika, the girl who initially gets played off as a picture-perfect idol, in other words, a stuck-up little brat, is actually closer to the opposite. That's why it's fitting that her overall design and personality take clear inspiration from the artwork Sushio did for Bish, an idol group which is as deliberately aggressive toward idol culture as they can possibly get away with. It's easy to see that her innocent act is only surface level, and that she acts like a sort of tsundere, saying the exact opposite of what she means or being intentionally misleading about how she phrases things in order to seem emotionally cut off or distant. There's definitely a lot more to say about her character than that, though, like, for example, that her entire story arc represents the hellish level of responsibility an influencer has, based on their level of fame, and that because of that fame, everything they say or do can and will have consequences on the actions of their fans. All in all, Rika is an interesting character as a result. In many ways, more interesting than Ohto herself, and certainly more interesting than Nieru, the robot girl over here, but Nieru is more thematically fitting, and as such, we're going to be talking about her a lot more than we will about Rika, which is why I want to briefly elaborate on her before we move any further into Wonder Egg Priority's story. Like I said before, Rika's story has very little to do with idol culture being toxic. though that opinion is made clear by her design as stated before, and very much to do with the responsibility that comes with influence. The girls and Wonder Killer she first faces off against, barring the actual pedophile we see her face at the beginning of episode 3, often call back to the idea that they only followed in an idol's footsteps. Yu died, so they have decided to die too. The main difference between the Wonder Killer and the girls themselves being that the Wonder Killer was likely the stalker that drove Yu to give into the temptation of death, while these two fangirls, whose designs are really awesome and memorable, only followed what they perceived as Yu's example. No, not that Yu, but it was also Rika's harsh words that led to the death of her friend, which we later find out was extremely tragic and deeply emotionally affected Rika to the point where she now uses this sort of magical playground to escape her troubled reality and strained relationship with her mother. No, not that Rika. This Rika. The point I'm trying to make here is that while the actual circumstances aren't anything I haven't seen before in anime, the message being delivered through Rika's story actually is. She was only trying to help. She wanted the girl she now playfully calls her little wallet to have a more respectable life than what she had seen, and believed that if she said something to her that could get her away from idols for good, she might grow up to be someone who was better than a petty shoplifter. What she failed to realize is that her intent failed to come through, that her harsh words as an influencer were taken at face value. It is Rika's fault that she lost someone that she only wanted to look out for. That pain is what brought her here. That pain is why she wields a box cutter and not a microphone. Words cut deep when you have notoriety. And who was it that never saw fit to teach her that? Who was it who taught her to be an idol? Who doesn't have a respectable life in the family? This is how Rika's story begins. But rather than tell you how it ends, I think it's time we use that context to explain why it matters so much that Rika should happen to meet up with a sunflower, and how all of this ties into Wonder Egg's thesis point. We've had our fun, going nice and slow with my analysis, but my ingredients aren't getting any fresher, and now that the oven is on, I think it's time to get cooking for real.